They called his cello case a beggar's fiddle. That was their first mistake. The air on the highway was thick with Texas heat, the kind that sticks to your skin and bakes the asphalt until it shimmers. Dr. Alistair Finch drove with the windows down, letting the hot, dusty wind whip through the cab of his 1988 Ford pickup. The truck, a relic of rust and resilience he called Old Ben, was his father's last gift, and it hummed a low, rumbling song that Alistair knew better than any symphony. In the passenger seat, strapped in with 3 separate bungee cords and swaddled in a thick velvet blanket, was Estelle. Estelle was a 1741 Domenico Montagnana cello. Her body was carved from ancient maple and spruce, her varnish the color of burnt honey, her voice a deep, resonant soul that had sung in the grandest halls of Vienna, Paris, and Milan. To most, she would look like an old, oversized violin in a battered case. To Alistair, she was a living, breathing extension of his own spirit. The flashing lights appeared in his rear-view mirror like a sudden, violent migraine, red and blue, pulsing against the wide, empty sky. Alistair's hands, which could coax the most delicate pianissimo from Estelle's strings, tightened on the steering wheel. He knew the drill. He was a black man in a beaten-down truck in a part of the country where that combination was often seen as probable cause. He pulled over to the gravel shoulder, the truck sputtering in protest. He turned off the engine, and the sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the crunch of boots on stone. 2 officers approached, one on each side, their movements practiced and predatory. The one at his window was young, with a fresh buzz cut and a jaw that looked like it had been chiseled from concrete. His name tag read Miller. "License and registration," Miller said, his voice flat, devoid of courtesy. Alistair moved slowly, deliberately, retrieving the documents from his glove compartment. He'd learned long ago that sudden movements were an invitation for escalation. He handed them over. Miller took them, his eyes scanning not the papers but the man holding them. He saw the worn chambray shirt, the faint dusting of rosin on his trousers, the calm, deep-set eyes that held no fear, only a profound weariness. Miller's gaze drifted to the passenger seat. "What's that?" he asked, nodding toward the hulking, coffin-shaped case. "It's a cello," Alistair replied, his voice even and low, a baritone that could fill a concert hall without a microphone. The second officer, a heavier man with a walrus mustache, peered through the other window and snorted. "A cello in this thing?" He gestured around at the truck's peeling dashboard and cracked vinyl seats. Miller smirked, a cruel, thin line. He tapped the roof of the truck with his knuckles. The sound was a dull thud. "You a musician or something?" Alistair simply nodded. "Something like that." The answer wasn't enough for Miller. It wasn't submissive enough. He wanted a reaction, a flinch, a spark of anger he could extinguish with the weight of his authority. He leaned in closer, his sunglasses reflecting Alistair's stoic face. "So what? You headin' into town to play a few songs for your supper?" he drawled, the insult wrapped in a syrupy, condescending tone. "Busking on some street corner with that old fiddle?" Alistair froze. The world went silent. The wind stopped. The heat vanished. Old fiddle. The word struck a chord deeper and more dissonant than any he had ever played. He thought of Estelle's history. The hands that had crafted her in a dusty Venetian workshop nearly 3 centuries ago. The royal courts she had graced. The wars she had survived. The symphonies she had led. He thought of the weight of her in his arms, the way her vibrations traveled through the endpin, into the floor and up through his bones, making his entire body a part of her song. And this man, this boy with a badge and a swagger, had dismissed her, dismissed him, with a casual, venomous flick of his tongue. Alistair didn't speak. He wouldn't give Miller the satisfaction. He looked straight ahead, his gaze fixed on the shimmering horizon. He would not let this moment, this grubby little patch of roadside gravel, be the stage for his anger. His stage was elsewhere. Miller waited, his smirk fading into a tight-lipped scowl. The silence was not the respectful fear he was used to. It was something else. It was a wall. He handed the license and registration back through the window with a sharp, dismissive snap of his wrist. "Get your taillight fixed," he grunted, then turned and walked back to his patrol car, the other officer following in his wake. Alistair didn't watch them go. He sat there for a long moment, his hands resting on the wheel, the echo of the insult ringing in the silent truck. He took a deep, slow breath, then another. He reached over and gently, almost reverently, touched Estelle's case. Not here, he thought. Not now. He started the engine. The old truck rumbled back to life, a faithful, grounding sound. As he pulled back onto the highway, the insult didn't fade. It settled inside him, a cold, hard knot of fuel. Miller thought he had won, that he had put a man in his place. He had no idea that all he had done was compose the prelude to a performance that would bring a city to its knees. Officer Frank Miller drove home with a sour taste in his mouth. The encounter with the man in the truck had unsettled him, though he wouldn't admit it, even to himself. The man's silence had been more infuriating than any curse word. It was a kind of power Miller didn't understand and couldn't dominate. He'd wanted to provoke, to see the man unravel, but all he'd gotten was that unnerving, quiet dignity. It felt like punching water. He walked into his house, the air conditioning a welcome relief from the oppressive heat. His wife, Eleanor, was in the living room, dressed in a silk blouse and tailored slacks, a single pearl necklace at her throat. She was getting ready to go out. "There you are," she said, her smile bright but strained. "I was starting to worry. Don't forget we have the symphony tonight. It's the season opener." Frank grunted, loosening his tie. "Right. The symphony." He said the word like it was a chore, another one of Eleanor's attempts to sand down his rough edges and fit him into her world of art galleries and wine tastings. He loved his wife, but he hated her world. It felt like a constant, unspoken judgment on his own. "It's not just the symphony, Frank," she said, a familiar note of exasperation in her voice. "It's Alistair Finch. They say he's the greatest living cellist. We were lucky to get tickets. They sold out months ago." Frank tossed his keys onto the counter with a clatter. "Great. Another guy in a penguin suit scraping a fiddle." The insult he'd used earlier on the roadside felt good to repeat, a way of reclaiming the power he'd felt slip through his fingers. Eleanor's smile tightened. "It's a cello, Frank, and he doesn't scrape it. He's a genius. People fly in from all over the world to hear him play. It's supposed to be transformative." "Transformative," he scoffed, pulling a beer from the fridge. "It's just noise for rich people. What's it got to do with real life?" "It has to do with beauty," she retorted, her voice rising slightly. "It has to do with feeling something other than this." She gestured vaguely around the room, at the comfortable furniture, the framed photos, the life they had built that somehow felt like a cage to both of them. Frank took a long pull from his beer, the cold liquid doing little to cool the simmering anger inside him. He didn't want to go to the symphony. He didn't want to sit in an uncomfortable chair surrounded by people who looked down on him, people who saw his uniform and his calloused hands and dismissed him, just as he had dismissed the man in the truck. The irony was lost on him. "I had a long day, Elle," he said, his voice softening into a weary plea. "Can't we just skip it?" "No," she said, her tone firm, final. "We can't. I need this. I need to feel like there's something more than traffic stops and property disputes. I need to hear something beautiful." She looked at him, her eyes pleading. "Please, Frank, for me." He stared at her, at the hope in her eyes, a hope he felt he was constantly failing to meet. He sighed, the fight draining out of him. "Fine," he muttered. "Fine. I'll go, but don't expect me to enjoy it." She smiled, a genuine, relieved smile this time. "Thank you." She came over and kissed his cheek. "Just try to listen with an open heart. They say his music can change you." Frank finished his beer and went to shower, the hot water washing away the grime of the day but not the residue of his encounter. As he put on the suit he hated, the stiff collar choking him, he thought again of the man in the truck. The calm eyes, the unnerving silence. "Old Fiddle," he had said. He felt a flicker of something, not quite regret, but a sigh or unsettling feeling of a battle poorly fought. He pushed it down. It was just some drifter, a nobody. He'd forget him by morning. He had no idea he was about to see him again in less than 2 hours. And this time, the entire city would be watching. The backstage area of the Winspear Opera House was a world of hushed reverence. The air smelled of old wood, rosin, and the faint, electric tang of anticipation. Alistair Finch stood alone in his dressing room, the door closed against the quiet chaos of stagehands and orchestra members warming up. He wasn't wearing his worn chain-brace shirt now. He was dressed in a traditional black tailcoat, the sharp lines accentuating his tall, lean frame. He was no longer the man from the roadside. He was the maestro. But the insult lingered. Old Fiddle. It had clung to him all afternoon, a stubborn burr on his soul. After arriving at his hotel, he hadn't practiced, not at first. He had simply sat with Estelle, running his hands over her familiar curves, feeling the grain of the wood beneath his fingertips. He'd felt the humiliation try to curdle into rage, a hot, useless anger that would serve no one, least of all his music. So he did what he had always done. He took the ugliness of the world and decided to make it beautiful. He would not play in spite of the insult. He would play through it. He would take the officer's casual cruelty, his dismissal, his blindness, and channel it into the bow. That feeling, that small, bitter human poison, would become a part of the performance. It would be the grit in the oyster that creates the pearl. He picked up his bow, its horsehair shimmering under the dressing room lights. He tightened it, the familiar creak a comforting sound. Then he picked up Estelle. He didn't place her on the ground. He held her in his arms, his cheek resting against her cool, smooth scroll the same way a father might hold a child. "He did not see you, my love," he whispered, his voice a low rumble. "But they will all see you tonight." There was a soft knock on the door. "5 minutes, Dr. Finch." "Thank you," he called back. He stood up, took a deep breath, and walked out of the room, Estelle in one hand, his bow in the other. He moved through the labyrinthine corridors with a calm, focused grace. He nodded to the concertmaster, shared a quiet smile with a violinist he'd known for 20 years. He was home. As he waited in the wings, he could hear the murmur of the crowd, a beast of 1,000 hearts, all waiting. He could feel their collective breath, their anticipation. He closed his eyes, shutting out the lights, the sounds, the expectations. He went back to the roadside. The heat, The dust, the sneer on the officer's face, old Fiddle. He let the memory wash over him, not to be wounded by it again, but to harness it. The first piece on the program was Bach's Cello Suite No. 1. It was a piece of pure, unadorned grace, a conversation between the cellist and his instrument. But tonight, it would be something more. It would be an answer. The stage manager gave him the signal. Alistair walked out from the wings and into the blinding white light of the stage. The applause was instantaneous, a wave of sound that washed over him. He walked to the center of the stage, bowed deeply to the audience, and then again to the orchestra. He took his seat on the simple wooden riser, the spotlight isolating him, making him the sole focus of 2,000 pairs of eyes. He settled Estelle, the endpen finding its familiar mark on the floor. He raised his bow. The applause faded into a hushed, reverent silence. The entire hall held its breath. And in that silence, Alistair looked out into the sea of faces. He couldn't see them clearly, the lights were too bright. But he knew they were there. And somewhere among them, he knew, was a man who saw only an old fiddle. He began to play. Frank Miller fidgeted in his velvet seat. He hated the symphony. The forced silence, the stuffy air, the way everyone seemed to know when to clap and when to hold a polite, intellectual cough. He felt like a fraud, a bull in a china shop. Eleanor, beside him, was radiant, her eyes fixed on the stage with an almost spiritual devotion. She looked beautiful, and it made him feel even more out of place. "Isn't it magnificent?" she whispered as the orchestra finished their opening piece. "It's fine," Frank mumbled, tugging at his collar. Then the lights dimmed further, and a single, intense spotlight illuminated the center of the stage. A man walked out, tall and graceful in a black tailcoat, carrying a cello. The audience erupted in applause, a genuine, thunderous ovation. Frank watched, unimpressed. Just another guy in a penguin suit, like he'd said. He was about to make another cynical comment to Eleanor when the man turned to face the audience and took his bow. The light caught his face. And Frank Miller's world tilted on its axis. He stopped breathing. His heart seized in his chest, a cold, painful clench. It couldn't be. It was impossible, but there was no mistaking him. The calm, deep-set eyes, the strong, quiet posture, the face that had stared back at him from the driver's seat of a beat-up Ford pickup just hours ago. It was him, the man he had mocked, the man he had belittled, the drifter, the busker. Eleanor leaned over, her voice a hushed, ecstatic whisper. "There he is, that's Alistair Finch." Frank couldn't speak. His throat was a knot of sand and cement. He stared, his mind reeling, trying to reconcile the two images. The man in the dusty chambray shirt on a gravel roadside, and this king, seated on a throne of light, holding the entire room in the palm of his hand. Alistair Finch raised his bow. A profound silence fell over the hall. It was a silence Frank recognized. It was the same silence from the traffic stop, but magnified 1,000 times. It wasn't empty, it was full. It was power. Then the first note came. It wasn't just a note. It was a voice. A sound so pure, so rich, so full of sorrow and beauty that it seemed to bypass the ears and resonate directly in the soul. It was the voice of the cello of Estelle, and it filled every inch of the massive hall. Frank felt the sound in his bones, a vibration that shook him to his core. Alistair played the Bach suite not just with technical perfection, but with a raw, heartbreaking emotion that felt deeply personal. The music spoke of dignity in the face of suffering, of grace under pressure, of a quiet, unyielding strength. It was the story of the traffic stop, told in a language everyone could understand. It was his answer, and it was devastating. Frank sat frozen, paralyzed. He watched Alistair's hands, the same hands that had held the steering wheel, now moving over the strings with an intimacy that was almost painful to watch. He saw the focus in his eyes, the way his body swayed with the music, becoming one with the instrument. This was not a man playing a cello. This was a soul speaking through wood and horsehair. He risked a glance at Alina. Tears were streaming down her face, silent and unchecked. She wasn't just listening, she was being transformed just as she'd hoped. Her face was a canvas of pure, unadulterated awe. She was in the presence of greatness, and she knew it. And Frank had called him a busker. He had mocked his instrument as an old fiddle. The shame that washed over him was a physical force, a wave of heat that spread from his chest to his face. He wanted to shrink, to disappear, to vanish from his velvet seat. Every note from the stage was a judgment. Every beautiful phrase was a testament to his own staggering ignorance, his own petty cruelty. The entire audience was captivated, hanging on every sound, giving this man their complete, undivided reverence. The man Frank had treated like dirt on the side of the road was a god in this hall. The final note of the Bach suite hung in the air, a shimmering, perfect echo. For a long moment, there was absolute silence. No one moved, no one breathed. It was as if the world had paused to honor what it had just heard. Then the room exploded. The applause was a tidal wave, a roar of pure, unadulterated adoration. People leaped to their feet, shouting "Bravo!" Alina was up, clapping so hard her hands must have stung, her face shining with tears and joy. Frank remained seated, a stone in a river of praise. He couldn't clap. He couldn't move. He could only stare at the man on the stage who was now bowing, accepting the wave of love from the audience with that same quiet, unshakable dignity he'd had on the side of the road. Alistair Finch had not said a single word to him. He hadn't needed to. His art was his vengeance, and it was absolute. The drive home was a tomb. The roaring applause of the concert hall had been replaced by a silence so thick and heavy it felt like a physical weight in the car. Frank gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, his eyes fixed on the road but seeing nothing. Beside him, Alina was quiet, still wrapped in the afterglow of the performance. The scent of her perfume, usually a comfort, now felt like an accusation. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft, still trembling with the lingering emotion of the music. He was magnificent. The words, so simple, so true, landed on Frank like a final, crushing blow. It was the verdict. She wasn't just talking about the music. She was talking about the man he had humiliated. "I've never heard anything like it," she continued, her gaze distant, lost in the memory. It was like he was telling a story. There was so much pain in it, but so much strength too. It was transcendent. Frank said nothing. What could he say? I met him today. I called his cello an old fiddle. I asked him if he played on street corners for money. The words were bile in his throat. Alina turned to look at him, her expression shifting from awe to concern as she finally noticed his rigid posture, the graveyard silence that surrounded him. "Frank, are you okay? You haven't said a word since we left." He flinched. "I'm fine." The lie was brittle, pathetic. "You're not fine," she pressed, her voice gentle. "Did you not like it? I know it's not your usual thing, but I thought even you would have been moved by that." Moved? He had been dismantled, obliterated. He had walked into that concert hall a man secure in his small, brutish power, and had walked out a hollow shell exposed in the blinding light of true greatness. He hadn't just been wrong, he had been pathetic. His authority, his badge, his uniform, it had all meant nothing in the face of that man's talent. The man in the beat-up truck had a universe inside him. Frank just had a gun and a bad attitude. It wasn't the music, he finally managed to say, his voice raspy. Alina waited. He couldn't tell her. To admit what he had done would be to confirm every doubt she'd ever had about him, to prove that he was exactly the small, bitter man she feared he was becoming. The shame was a private, burning hell, and he would have to live in it alone. They drove the rest of the way in silence. When they got home, Alina went straight to the bedroom, her earlier joy now muted by his inexplicable mood. Frank walked into the kitchen and stood in the dark, staring out the window at the reflection of his own face. He saw the lines of anger etched around his mouth. He saw the hardness in his eyes. He saw the man who had looked at Dr. Alistair Finch and seen nothing of value. The world was full of beauty, of genius, of souls like Alistair Finch, who carried entire symphonies within them. And he, Frank Miller, was walking through it all with his eyes closed, seeing only what his own prejudice allowed him to see. He had tried to make a man feel small, and in doing so had revealed only how small he truly was. He didn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the cello. He heard Estelle's voice, a sound of heartbreaking beauty and profound strength. It was the sound of a man who refused to be defined by the ugliness of a moment, a man who could take an insult and transform it into art. Alistair Finch would likely never think of him again. He was a passing shadow, a piece of roadside gravel on a journey to a palace of sound. But Frank would never forget him. That man and his music would now be a permanent part of his own story, a haunting, beautiful reminder of the day he came face to face with God and had been too blind to see it. Some victories are won with fists and fury. Others are won with a bow, 4 strings, and a silence that says everything.